8 multiplication of binomials containing radicals. When we are doing these, we are either distributing or foiling. You need to be careful and you need to make sure that you're paying attention to exactly what they are asking you to do. So if we look at example 1a, we are simplifying. We have the square root of 3 times 4 square root 2 minus 3. So we are going to distribute this square root 3 in and just do the square root of 3 times 4 square root 2 plus the square root of 3 times negative 3. The square root of 3 times 4 square root 2 is 4 square root 6. And the square root of 3 times negative 3 is negative 3 square root 3. So this gives us 4 square root 6 minus 3 square root 3. If you could simplify those radicals at this time, you would do so as well. For b, we have the square root of 6 times 5 square root 2 minus the square root of, minus 6 square root 3. So again, we are going to distribute this square root 6 in. So we're going to do 5 square root 2 times square root 6 minus 6 square root 3 times square root 6. Now I want to break this up before I even multiply. It might give me a little bit easier way of doing this. So if I did that, my 5 square root 2 times the square root of 6 would be 5 square root 2 times the square root of 2 times 3, which I can just add into that radical of 2 times 3. Then that negative 6 square root 3 times the square root of 6, that square root 3 times the square root of 6 is the same thing as the square root of 3 times the square root of 3 times 2, which we can just add underneath that radical as well. So when doing this, we can pair up our groups of 2 here. For that 5 square root 2 times 2 times 3, the 2's pair up. So we're going to do 5 times 2 square root 3. And then for that negative 6 times the square root of 3 times 3 times 2, those 3's pair up. So I'm going to pull out that 3 and leave the 2 underneath the radical and multiply the 6 and the 3. For the 5 times 2 square root 3, 5 times 2 is 10. Keep the square root of 3. And then for the negative 6 times 3, that's going to be negative 18. Keep the square root of 2. For C, we have 5 square root 2 times 3 square root 3 plus 8 square root 2. So we're just going to distribute this in. We have 5 square root 2 times 3 square root 3. That's going to give us 15 square root 6. And then 5 square root 2 times 8 square root 2 is 40 square root 4. Simplify this. The square root of 6 you cannot, so leave it. 15 square root 6. The 40 times 4, the square root of 4 is 40 times 2. So 40 times 2 is 80. That's going to give us 15 square root 6 plus 80. For D, we have 2 square root 7 times 8 square root 5 plus 4 square root 11. I'm going to just distribute this in. So 2 times 8 is 16. 7 times 5 is 35. That's giving me 16 square root 35. 2 square root 7 times 4 square root 11. 2 times 4 is 8. 7 times 11 is 77. So we have 16 square root 35 plus 8 square root 77. The 35, their only factors are 3 and 5. So those don't pair up with another 3 or another 5. And then with the 77, it's 7 and 11, which are both prime numbers as well. So those don't pair up either. If we look at our next part, we are foiling these. So first, inner, outer, last. You're taking that 6 and distributing it into the second set of parentheses. You're taking that 11 and distributing it into the second set of parentheses. So this is going to give us 6 times 6 minus the square root of 11 plus the square root of 11 times 6 minus the square root of 11. We distribute in that 6. We're going to have 36 minus 6 square root 11 and then a positive 6 square root 11 minus the square root of 121. We simplify this. The 36 is going to stay. The negative 6 square root 11 and the 6 square root of 11 are opposites, so they cancel each other out. And then that square root of that 121 is 11. So this is 36 minus 11, which gives us 25. For B, we have 8 square root 7 minus 12 times 8 square root 7 plus 12. So again, we're going to FOIL this. So we're going to do 8 square root 7 times 8 square root 7 plus 12, and then negative 12 times 8 square root 7 plus 12. So 8 square root 7 times 8 square root 7 is just going to be 64 times the square root of 49. The 8 square root 7 times 12, 8 times 12 is 96 square root 7. The negative 12 times 8 square root 7 is going to be negative 96 square root 7. And then the negative 12 times positive 12 is a negative 144. So we simplify these. Those 96 square roots of 7 cancel out since they're opposites. We're going to have 64 times 7 minus 144. The 64 times 7, 7 times 4 is 28. The 7 times 6 is 42, plus 2 is 44. So we have 448 minus 144. When we do this, we get 304. For C, we have 3 square root 2 plus 5 times the square root of 5 minus 3 square root 2. We're going to FOIL this. So we're going to have 3 square root 2 times the square root of 5 minus 3 square root 2 plus 5 times the square root of 5 minus 3 square root 2. So I'm going to distribute this in. 3 square root 2 times the square root of 5 is 3 square root 10. 3 square root 2 times negative 3 square root 2 is a negative 9 square root 4. Then we have the 5 times the square root of 5, which is 5 square root 5. And 5 times the negative 3 square root 2 is negative 15 square root 2. So we simplify this further. The 3 square root 10 cannot simplify, we leave it. The negative 9 times the square root of 4 is negative 9 times 2. The 5 square root 5 is going to stay. And same with the negative 15 square root 2. We simplify this even further to give us 3 square root 10 minus 18 plus 5 square root 5 minus 15 square root 2. For D, we have 9 square root 2 plus 8 square root 5 times 3 square root 3 plus 6 square root 2. So I am going to FOIL 9 square root 2 times 3 square root 3. It's going to give me 27 square root 6. The 9 square root 2 times 6 square root 2 is 54 square root 4. The 8 square root 5 times 3 square root 3 is going to be 24 square root 15. And the 8 square root 5 times 6 square root 2 is 48 square root 10. Simplify that square root of 4, that's 2. So we have 27 square root 6 plus 54 times 2 plus 24 square root 15 plus 48 square root 10. From here, the only thing that I can do is multiply the 54 and 2, which gives me 108. So this is 27 square root 6 plus 108 plus 24 square root 15 plus 48 square root 10. For our next set of examples, we're still simplifying these and we're still multiplying. So we have 3 plus the square root of 5 squared. So this is going to give me the same exact result as 3 plus the square root of 5 times 3 plus the square root of 5. So I'm going to FOIL this in. 3 times 3 is 9. 3 times the square root of 5 is 3 square root 5. 5 times 3, or 5, the square root of 5 times 3 is 3 square root 5, and the square root of 5 times the square root of 5 is the square root of 25. So I'm going to simplify this. The 3 square root 5s are like terms, so this is going to give me 9 plus 6 square root 5, and then that 25 underneath the radical is going to give me a 5. So I combine like terms again, then 9 plus 5 gives us 14 plus 6 square root 5. For B, we have 2 square root 3 minus 5 square root 7 squared. So I'm going to multiply this by itself and FOIL. 2 square root 3 times 2 square root 3 is 4 square root 9. 2 square root 3 times negative 5 square root 7 is negative 10 square root 21. The negative 5 square root 7 times 2 square root 3 is a negative 10 square root 21. And the negative 5 square root 7 times negative 5 square root 7 is a positive 25 square root 49. I'm going to be left with 4 times 3 minus 20 square root 21 plus 25 times 7. I can multiply from here. 4 times 3 is 12 minus 20 square root 21. Then I have 25 times 7. The 5 times 7 is 35. 5 times 7 is 14 plus 3 is 17. So 12 minus 20 square root 21 plus 175. If I add these two numbers together, the 12 and the 175, this is going to leave me with 187 minus 20 square root 21. For C, we have 5 minus the square root of 3 squared. So I'm going to just rewrite this and FOIL. So 5 times 5 is 25. 5 times the negative square root of 3 is negative 5 square root 3. Negative square root of 3 times 5 is negative 5 square root 3. And negative square root of 3 times negative square root of 3 is a positive square root 9. I simplify. 25 minus 10 square root 3 plus 3. The 25 plus 3 is 28 minus 10 square root 3. For D, we have 3 square root 13 minus 6 square root 2 times 3 square root 13 minus 6 square root 2. So I'm going to FOIL. The 3 times 3 is 9. The 13 times 13 is 169. So that's 9 square root 169. The 3 square root 13 times negative 6 square root 2. 3 times negative 6 is negative 18 square root 26. The negative 6 times 3 is negative 18 square root 26 again. The negative 6 times negative 6 is a positive 36. And the square root of 2 times the square root of 2 is the square root of 4. I'm going to simplify from here. We're going to have 9 times 13 minus 36 square root 26 plus 36 times 2. The 9 times 13, 9 times 3 is 27. 9 times 1 plus 2 is 11, so that's 117 minus 36 square root 2, 6, plus 36 times 2, which is 72. I combine my like terms with that 117 and the 72 to give me 189 minus 36 square root 26. With our denominators that we have that are binomials that include radicals, we still have to rationalize these. By doing this, it's a lot easier than we did before. The only thing we have to do with these is to take the conjugate of the denominator, which means keep the terms, switch the sign in between them, and multiply the top and the bottom by that. And that will get rid of our radical. So if we look at example A, we have 3 over 5 minus 2 square root 7. So the conjugate, we're going to actually put parentheses around this 5 minus 2 square root 7. The conjugate of this 5 minus 2 square root 7 is literally keep the terms, so 5, 2 square root 7, change the sign between them. So it's going to be 5 plus 2 square root 7. What we multiply to the bottom, we do to the top. So top and bottom gets multiplied by 5 plus 2 square root 7. We distribute that 3 in on the top and we FOIL on the bottom. This is going to give us 15 plus 6 square root 7 all over. The 5 times 5 is 25 plus 10 square root 7 minus 10 square square root 7 minus 4 square root 49. So from here, the 15 plus 6 square root 7 is going to stay. On the bottom, these 10 square root 7s are going to cancel. So we're going to have 25 minus 4 times 7, which is 28. So 15 plus 6 square root 7 all over negative 28. Now, look to see if you can simplify this. First off, that negative on the bottom, you have to switch to a positive. You cannot have a negative on the bottom. So when you do that, you switch the signs on the top, and then you ask yourself, 15, 6, and 28, do they share a common factor? In this case, no. So our answer is negative 15 minus 6 square root 7 all over 28. Again, our denominator has to be positive. For B, we have 8 over the square root of 3 plus 4. Our conjugate of our denominator is the square root of 3 minus 4. So we're going to multiply that by the top and the bottom. On the top, distribute that 8. So we're going to have 8 square root 3 minus 8 times 4 is 32. All over the square root of 3 times the square root of 3 is the square root of 9 minus 4 square root 3 plus 4 square root 3 minus 16. Simplify what you can. You have 8 square root 3 minus 32 over 3. Those 4 square root 3's cancel. Minus 16. 3 minus 16 is negative 13. So this is 8 square root 3 minus 32 all over negative 13. Again, you cannot have a negative in the denominator, so turn it into a positive. Change the signs on top. This is giving us 8 square root 3 plus 32 all over 13. For C, we have 5 over 2 plus 3 square root of 11. So your conjugate of our denominator is 2 minus, so opposite, 3 square root of 11. Multiply top and bottom by that 2 minus 3 square root of 11. Distribute that 5 on the top, FOIL the bottom. This is going to leave us with 10 minus 15 square root of 11 over 4 minus 6 square root of 11 plus 6 square root of 11 minus 9 square root of 121. From here, 10 minus 15 square root of 11 is going to stay. On the bottom, those 6 square roots of 11 are canceling. So we have 4 minus 9 times 11. 4 minus 9 times 11 is 4 minus 99. So 10 minus 15 square root of 11 over 4 minus 99. This is going to leave us with 10 minus 15 square root of 11 over negative 95. All of these are divisible by 5, and we have to change the signs on everything. So this is going to be a negative 2, a positive 3, and then that 95. 5 goes into 95. 1, 4 left over 19 times. So this is negative 2 plus 3 square root of 11 all over 19. For D, we have 3 plus the square root of 2 over 1 minus 3 square root of 2. So we're going to multiply each the top and the bottom by the conjugate of 1 minus 3 square root of 2, which is 1 plus 3 square root of 2. So we are going to FOIL both the top and the bottom now. So 3 times 1 is 3. 3 times 3 square root of 2 is 9 square root of 2. The square root of 2 times 1 is square root of 2. And square root of 2 times 3 square root of 2 is 3 square root of 4. This is going to go all over. 1 times 1 is 1. 1 times 3 square root of 2 is 3 square root of 2. Negative 3 square root of 2 times 1 is negative 3 square root of 2. Negative 3 square root of 2 times 3 square root of 2 is negative 9 square root of 4. So from here, we are going to simplify and combine like terms. So top, the 9 square root 2 plus square root 2 is going to be 10 square root 2. So we have 3 plus 10 square root 2. And then that 3 times the square root of 4 is 3 times 2. On the bottom, those 3 square root 2's are going to cancel. So we have 1 minus 9 times the square root of 4, which is 9 times 2. Simplify even further. We have 3 plus 10 square root 2 plus 6 over 1 minus 18. The 3 plus 6 is 9, plus 10 square root 2 all over negative 17. We switch the signs here. So this is negative 9 minus 10 square root 2 all over 17. If we look at some extra practice problems with number 1, we have the square root of 5 plus 3 times the square root of 5 minus 3. So we are going to distribute here. We are going to get the square root of 25 minus 3 square root 5 plus 3 square root 5 minus 9. So these 3 square root 5's are canceling. We're just going to have 5 minus 9, which is negative 4. For 3, we have the square root of 2 plus 3 squared. So we're literally just going to multiply these by each other. So the square root of 2 plus 3 times the square root of 2 plus 3. FOIL these out. We're going to have the square root of 4 plus 3 square root 2 plus 3 square root 2 plus 9. Simplify. The square root of 4 is 2 plus 6 square root 2 plus 9. 2 plus 9 is 11. So 11 plus 6 square root 2. For 5, we're stating the conjugate of the binomial 8 plus 4 square root 5. So the conjugate of this, keep the terms, change the sign between them. Just 8 minus 4 square root 5. If we go back up to number 2, we have 8 minus the square root of 6. Oops, let's do this. 8 minus the square root of 6 times 8 plus the square root of 6. So we're going to FOIL. 8 times 8 is 64. 8 times the square root of 6 is 8 square root 6. Negative square root 6 times 8 is negative 8 square root 6. And negative square root 6 times square root 6 is a negative square root 36. So this is going to give us 64. These cancel. Minus 6, which is 58. For 4, we have 6 minus the square root of 11 squared. So that's 6 minus the square root of 11 times 6 minus the square root of 11. We're going to FOIL this. 6 times 6 is 36. 6 times negative square root of 11 is negative 6 square root 11. Negative square root 11 times 6 is negative 6 square root of 11. And the negative times the negative is positive square root 121. So this is going to give us 36 minus 12 square root 11 plus 11. 36 plus 11 is 47 minus 12 square root 11. For 6, that complex conjugate of negative 7 minus 3 square root 11. So we're keeping the two terms, just changing the sign between them. So this is negative 7 plus 3 square root of 11. For 7, we have negative 4 plus 6 square root 7. So this is going to give us negative 4 minus 6 square root 7. And lastly, with 8, we have 5 minus 8 square root 13. So the complex, or the conjugate of this is 5 plus 8 square root 13.